this lecture series at the university. It's in the 51st year, which is kind of amazing. Older than me, I wish. So I don't forget at the end, in case I forget at the end, we have another Frontiers lecture that's going to be on April 12th.
Give a plug for AAAS's Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and then go into what I did while I was at the State Department. So to start out, and hopefully it's working, at the Freer Sackler, we have an analytical chemistry lab as well as several microscopy instruments. Now I know this image is sort of difficult to see, but it's basically chromatography systems, liquid chromatography, gas chromatography, and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, as well as scanning electron microscopy and other microscopies. We've had a scientist on staff in this art museum since 1951, and this is our original scientist, and at that time they did a large project on Chinese bronzes. So here we have him with the director of the museum looking at an X-ray radiograph of a Chinese bronze vessel with a cross-section of the corrosion on the bronze at the right. So from the right edge, I lost it. From the right edge, you have the bronze and then cuprite and malachite, with the oxygen-poor cuprite closer to the bronze. He was very interested in what was characteristic versus, what might be an artificial patina at the time. And again, this is in the 50s, 60s, so it's quite early. So the types of research we do can stem from just basic identification to looking at the materials and method of works of art. This is a Mughal cup that is in the collection, and we had the question of what material was it? Is it glass? Is it a gemstone of some sort? So at the time we had a geologist on staff, and she was able to take a very, very small sample. So most of what you're looking at there is actually a piece of glue with a powder on it. And this is the location that she took from a chip. And she determined using X-ray diffraction that it was an emerald. So that was actually what the curators wanted to hear. So it was a good result, as you can imagine. And then some of the work that I've done has been looking at the glazes on ceramics of different types. This is an Abbasid or early Islamic ceramic from Iraq, so 9th to 10th century. And we were curious about the source of the cobalt on the glaze. It's known that you can have cobalt sources that have a geological formation that are high in iron or high in manganese. So that was one of the things we wanted to test. And while we always start with a non-destructive method, if you have two glazes, one on top of another, like you do here, the blue on top of a white glaze, if I'm doing an analysis down from the surface, I can't localize what I'm looking at from the top glaze or the bottom glaze. So we took a very, very small sample, and the size of this is approximately a half millimeter by 0.2 millimeter. So that just gives you the idea of the size. And we were able to then map where the cobalt is, and it takes very little cobalt to make a blue glaze, like 0.5% or less. And then we found that the manganese goes throughout the whole sample. So obviously our ore source is an iron type of ore. So these are just sort of a couple of different types of applications of science in a museum. But then, in 2015, the Freer Gallery closed. And the lab was in the Freer Gallery. This is a picture of the lab many, many years ago. And one of the things they wanted to do was bring the aesthetic back to what it was originally. So during this period, the lab went into storage. Our scanning electron microscope went into a crate. I loaned out X-ray fluorescence instruments to everyone I could. I tried to get the instruments out of the construction zone because they were being stored in place in the construction zone. So during that time, since the laboratory was in storage, I was able to take a leave of absence. And looking around for different opportunities as a leave, I found the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And I should say I borrowed slides from a lot of people for this talk, so these are AAAS's slides. Okay. So AAAS, or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I want to give a plug for this fellowship program, runs a fellowship program to get scientists into government. And it's not that you go into government and they tell you right up when you're applying for the fellowship that you might be doing something totally different from your background. And I actually ended up in something related. But the whole idea is that scientists are trained in logic, and scientists are trained in problem solving. So as a scientist, we can add to what government, add to the process of government and help solve the very difficult problems of government. There are placements in agencies throughout the executive branch. There's legislative fellows who are associated with the program, but for the most part, the legislative fellows are associated with a really great program to go into. And there were 261 of us in that year, and I am up here in this photo. Where I ended up from the fellowship process was at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs in the Department of State. This, the Cultural Heritage Center, is actually tasked to provide a center of expertise for the State Department on issues of cultural heritage. So most of my compatriots in the office were archaeologists. There were 4 or 5 PhD archaeologists on staff, depending on how you look at it, and also a historic preservation PhD. So they run programs that are mandated by law and by our agreements with other countries, as well as provide expertise wherever the government needs. The office was founded partially because of the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. So in the 1980s, the early 1980s, the US passed a law that said that we would implement this convention bilaterally with other countries. And since that time, we have had several agreements, so these are all bilateral treaties, that we have to support. And that office does research in support of those, runs meetings to support the committee that decides whether we're going to continue those treaties. In fact, the most recent one actually was just signed a couple weeks ago and is with Libya. So this means that if objects are found that were imported prior to either this law going into effect in the early 1980s or when these treaties are signed, even if those objects aren't known, if they're archaeological materials, that the country can then request that we repatriate them or return them. So these treaties are important as a means to provide a legal basis for materials that are in the ground that we don't know about, that are a resource that, if things are pillaged or looted, that they can then use these treaties to get them returned. The other large activity in the office that I was in is the Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation. They also do a lot of social media to highlight their efforts. And so this is another source of information on the office. But the Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation funds preservation projects around the globe. It's a public diplomacy tool, and it's also to help us preserve other countries' patrimony. It feeds into the 1970 convention efforts, but it also does marvelous work with restoring and protecting buildings, collection sites, and also inventorying those sites so that to help the other countries build their infrastructure so that they know what's going on. So this is sort of a background of the office I landed in, but they brought me on to actually look at different areas of cultural heritage that handle with Iraq and Syria. So they had a lot of extra programs because of everything that's going on in the Middle East right now. The office had a cooperative agreement with the American Schools of Oriental Research, as well as interactions with the Iraqi Institute for Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage, and then also supported efforts in the US to help with looted objects that make it here. So help train ICE detectives on various methods of the legal side of cultural property as well as the handling of objects. And those are the programs I'll talk about today. Several years ago, I looked at a glaze from a ceramic from Syria, and this is from the site of al-Sham. It was interesting, but I couldn't really get anything out of it because it was so corroded. And the cross sections here, the top one is an optical microscope image, and the bottom is a scanning electron microscope image, and it was so corroded I could not get a composition out of it. It was always my dream to go back to Syria to see this ceramic, because only the sample came out, the vessel just stayed there. It's quite common for an excavation to store their materials either in situ or send the more important objects to the museum. So this stayed in Syria, and I have no idea where it is. Given the amount of looting, there's a fairly good chance that it's been destroyed. To give you an idea of the types of sites, this is a map that shows when destruction happened at some of these more important sites in Iraq and also Syria. Starting, obviously, even before that, but major damage incidents. And this shows that it's a huge scale of destruction that's been going on for several years. The sites I'll talk about today, a little bit about Palmyra was the one on my title, was an image on my title slide. Nimrud, I'll be talking about in Iraq, and I'll mention Mosul. And then also up, Mart al-Numan is also up in the northwest corner of Syria. So you have the line between Iraq and Iraq down here in the lower portion of this map, and then Syria on the Mediterranean up here. But every day or every week you see social media reports of the destruction. It's ongoing. I talked recently to one of the people working on this project, and they said this last January was the largest report of damage that they had seen yet. So it's not like, even though ISIL is leaving, it's not like the destruction has stopped. As an illustration of how fast some of this destruction can happen, this map shows the state of areas that were looted at different dates. So the pink is August 4th, 2011. At that time, only those pink areas had been looted. Then yellow at December 28th, 2011. So still not very much of the site had been looted. On April 2nd, 2014, you had all of the blue areas looted. So the majority of the site is gone. This means not just the architecture above the site, but this means there are pits in the site where people have dug to see what they could find for looting. And then the green is 1 year later in April of 2015. So the main part of the site was looted at that period in 2014, but looting continued as time went on the exterior sides of the site. One of the main groups that I worked with was the American Schools of Oriental Research. And they have a cooperative agreement with the State Department, and I was looking at the day-to-day activities of that agreement, where they collect information from people on the ground. They also use any open source and record any social media, newspaper reports of things, and basically they're building a big database of what's going on when. And also looking and analyzing open, high-resolution satellite imagery. For their in-country documentation, they are building up incident reports. So every time someone reports an item of damage, they take a detailed description of the damage, and they have these sorted so they can look at a single site and say, well, we know that this happened in 2014, in March, in April, in June, and go back. This is in preparation for the day when hopefully we don't have a war going there and just people can go in and start to repair what's possible and stabilize as possible. The amount, it's very sad to just keep watching it. The satellite documentation, of course, you can't go into a war zone and document these losses. So a lot of what they do is spend time looking at satellite images and documenting the loss of various features. So this is a site in Palmyra, in Tetrapilan, and they can see that there was damage to 2 of those in January. I'm not sure which year this is. They take these reports and they write monthly reports, and these are available on their website. So it's a way of also raising consciousness for the public so people know what's going on. But this is a source that you can go in and read about, what's going on in terms of where in the country the most damage is going on in terms of the reports. Now, of course, they know they're not catching everything at this point. So the 13,000 sites that they have seen damage of 1,300 sites, is the minimum number, because that's the number that they have collected. And then this is up to December 2016. So this number has, of course, increased. But it's also not the total number, because we know that there's damage occurring that's not been recorded. So when you start to look at the different types of damage, the most heavy damage is, of course, where ISIL was, because they were doing very organized looting and destruction. So a lot more destruction in those areas, but that's not the only place. There's also damage, and they've categorized it by kinds of damage. So military activity, I know you can't read it quite, and the different kinds of military activity. So explosives is in the red area, a very general thing. So any of the fighting, you're going to have bombs exploding, and of course they're going to damage the heritage of the area. Military construction, tunneling, and then site management. So if just something about building a new building that doesn't belong there can damage the site. The same type of thing that we have in the US with where we have salvage archaeology, but to a much larger degree. Over this period, they found that the greatest damage caused was military activity with explosives, and then intentional destruction, which is what makes the TV and the videos, is actually a much smaller number, but of course it's a large amount of destruction. Illegal excavations, so looking for looting and objects, 102. Militarization, going all the way up to what I said, there's the construction and very small number, but still there and still present. So a second part of this project is trying to mitigate some of the damage and prevent some of it from happening. So the activities, the areas where the activities have focused have been in areas that were not controlled by the Syrian government, that were not getting the protection of the Syrian government. Because in the areas where the Syrian government is in charge, they had their Department of Antiquities who was overseeing these. But the areas, because since Syria is in a civil war right now, the areas that are controlled by the opposition, we're not getting funding, we're not getting help to protect their heritage. So some of these projects, very small projects, have focused in those areas. And of course, those are areas that are more accessible too. So in the Kamran Pasha, you can see there's been a lot of destruction from the damage. And this is important because it's actually used as a museum to collect together many of the objects found in some of the sites in the area. So on the walls, there's mosaics. In early 2015, the Smithsonian actually went over and trained them how to put sandbags up to protect the mosaics. And when a bombing came, the sandbags actually worked. So the mosaics were protected. Of course, a lot of the building was damaged. After that initial bombing, the State Department, the ASOR CHI project went over and helped them repair and not repair, but stabilize the broken masonry and add to the sandbags so that we would have more protection. So the first step would be just clearing off the debris in these sites. numbering the stones so you know where they came from, and putting them into an area where it's safe for them to remain, but where they're available for rebuilding. Anything that's going to fall, taking it down before it falls and does further damage. Stabilizing what you can. So this happened, and then in January of this year, it was bombed again. So this is 3 major campaigns of bombing. This one shows this corner is this corner. So the whole front of the colonnade has been lost now. And some of the mosaics were lost this time. So it's, you do what you can with the protection. And again, this is support that, we're trying to help them with. But inevitably, some things are lost. A second project was perhaps a little bit more intensive. There in Bosra al-Sham is a World Heritage Site, and a World Heritage Site is one that shows universal universal importance, so it's important to the world as a whole, and then meets various criteria. So this was already a World Heritage Site before the conflict, but it's in part of opposition-controlled Syria. So again, a very important site that didn't have external caretakers. But because in that part of Syria there was Bosra al-Sham Antiquities Department, a local antiquities department ready and able to take care of the site, they just didn't have any of the resources needed to take care of the site. The first thing that the project did was try to find out exactly what they needed, and then supplied equipment and computers so that they could do site surveys and figure out what to do, and then also supplied some funds for staff at the site and kept that going. And in a way, this has helped in 2 ways. It helps the site directly, but it also helps provide employment for some Syrians on the ground. And it's very hard to find food and jobs at this time, so we're also helping the population. Now, the group that I was working with, the ASOR CHI, is by no means the only group that's working on these activities in Syria and Iraq, and also working on ways to preserve the heritage of these areas. The lists in this slide are just a few of the different groups working to preserve heritage, and they organized a meeting where they could all come together. Because you have multiple groups who are documenting the heritage loss, multiple groups making bibliographies or recreating with 3D models, different things. So the idea was to try and avoid overlap, because there's so much to do and so much to protect that working together is the best way to go forward. So the NEH actually sponsored a meeting to bring them all together and discuss areas of overlap and possible collaboration, and try to put forward the collaborations. So I just wanted to highlight a couple sites. And Nimrud in Syria, it's ancient Kalhu or Kala. It's located in northern Iraq, and it was one of the sites that underwent a lot of damage. It's approximately 30 kilometers southeast of Mosul in Nineveh Governorate, on the eastern bank of an ancient bed of the Tigris River. The site was occupied from the 6th millennium BC through at least the Hellenistic period, but it's best known as capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the reign of Ashur-Nasirpal II from 883 to 859 BCE, up to the reign of Sargon II in the 8th century BCE, who built a new capital at Khorsabad. So in this site, and I know it's hard to see these pictures of damage and not have an idea of where they come from. So in this site, there is the northwest castle, And this model on the Met's website gives an idea of the scale of these things. So you see they've drawn in people and animals to help. The courtyards, on the walls of the courtyards, there are reliefs, and they'll show some of them in a second. And these sort of half animal, half person guardians, lamasu, on the doors. So just to give you an idea, in these courtyards, this is one of the sites that was partially destroyed. So what was remaining before any destruction were some of this is from one of the walls of one of the inner courtyards. So you have some of the stone panels, some of the reliefs. And this is one of the performative destructions that ISIL did before they were pushed out. So they put barrel bombs against these reliefs. So these barrels are all bombs. And then basically blew them up. So beforehand, these are satellite images that show the destruction. So beforehand, this is the palace. And afterwards, you can see that a lot of it is just gone. Now, luckily, a lot of pieces of it were remaining. So there are efforts that the State Department and Smithsonian and other groups are trying to go back and put back together what they can. Because since this is now free from ISIL, it's getting to be safer to go in there. But, obviously, it's not going to be possible to put it all back together. There's, many fragments that are much too small. It's difficult to get into this area right now because of the problems between the Kurds and Baghdad. So the Erbil airport, which was sort of the site that all the foreigners could fly into, has been closed. And so you would have to fly into Baghdad and go overground. And that's difficult given the security situation in the country. I just wanted to point out that, when we look at a lot of these sites, they look like they're in the middle of the desert. But the cities are seeing the same type of massive destruction. And so this is a picture from Mosul. And each of these, some are mosques, some are churches, are heavily destroyed, and they're historic buildings too. I mean, obviously the housing is, non-existent, but the historic structures that are in the towns are getting just as much damage. And in fact, a lot of what ISIL has been doing has been targeted at various religions. So some of those have gotten higher targeting at times. A second effort that's been underway since 2009 is the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage. And the Americans went in, there was a big discussion on how do you increase the infrastructure and the capacity in country. Are there ways to do it in Iraq versus bringing professionals out for classes external to the country? And the State Department funded the establishment of this institute in Erbil that teaches conservation to Iraqis. It's in conjunction with Winterthur, so professors from Winterthur and from other programs and other museums go and teach classes with the aim being to give the students a basic knowledge of conservation. So not just, this is how you glue a pot together, but this is why you glue a pot together. This is how different metals might behave and corrode. So give some of that basic knowledge to build a professional group of professionals who can then act themselves to care for the heritage. The effort has more recently been targeted to advanced classes and how do you specifically prepare for when these war zones become accessible again, and what are the skills that you need. So when I was there, they were doing an advanced class on ceramics. An advanced class on ceramics, and I believe they're doing another one on architecture this year, just to get people ready. And they use, as a classroom, some of these destroyed sites or objects in museums that have been heavily destroyed. It's been outfitted as well as they could, and so there's some pretty modern classrooms in it, and it gets used by many groups. So it's also available because it is not an American center, it's actually an Iraqi center. So several different groups have gone in and used the space to teach classes. But again, a lot of the education is hands-on. So this is a picture of a couple of the students doing experiments to look at how different materials behave with different solutions and how corrosion proceeds. And then they're making stone carving tools, because part of being able to preserve the materials is understanding how they were made. And then a view from the ceramics class of measuring and documenting materials in situ. So they've created sort of a false or a model excavation site, and they're practicing there. One of the other areas that State Department and that I was able to be involved in was working with some of the Homeland Security agents in training programs. And the Homeland Security actually has a program in the cultural property, art, and antiquities for investigations of objects that have entered the country illegally, or just various parts of art and archaeology trade. And since 2009, the training has been sort of a joint project of the State Department, Homeland Security, and the Smithsonian to look at, here they're learning proper handling techniques for artifacts. Because you can imagine if a border patrol or an agent comes and wants to open a box, there's right ways and there's wrong ways to open a box to put or to protect the objects that are inside of it. So they learn things like wearing gloves and how to photograph objects. And also they learn information on what are the laws that they can follow. In recent times, other agencies have also instituted similar trainings or come to this training. And so some of the Customs and Border Patrols, our agents are also coming now. So one of the interesting stories that started before I got there and continued while I was there stems to a raid that was done on an ISIL leader in May of 2015, Abu Sayyaf. And in his house, he was killed in the raid. It was US Special Forces, and in his house they found antiquities, a bunch of antiquities, but they also found a lot of information on the ISIL, the ISIL's organization of the antiquities trade. So documents such as these receipts for antiquities, and I think I have a translation. So this is one with a translation. And approximately 20% of the sale amount was taxed by ISIL. So the sale, these illegal looted antiquities were then sold, and 20% of that money went back to ISIL. The structure was based on natural resources because these archaeological materials that were being dug up and looted were considered a natural resource. And well, I mean, they are a natural resource, they're a non-renewable one. But he was also the head of the oil. So this was sort of classed in with minerals and oils. And you can see he was the head of the antiquities for the various parts of the ISIL Caliphate. And all of these things were found in this raid. So basically it says that we would like to let you know that Brother Abu Abd al-Rahman al-Tunisi is authorized to do the following: to dig for relics in the territories of the Islamic State, to authorize suitable people, and to supervise them, and to arrest anyone who digs for relics without the authorization of the Ministry of Natural Resources, Department of Antiquities. So all of these things stemmed back to Abu Sayyaf. And in digital files, they found images of several objects that were authenticated and were in backgrounds that looked like they were ready to be sold. So since it's illegal for, and the money that's going to terrorist organizations can be confiscated to international terrorist organizations. The Justice Department actually put forward a case to confiscate these objects and to seize these objects. So this happened right before I left state. About a year later, they found that one of the rings, the gemstone ring, had been sold in Turkey for more than a couple $100,000. And they actually were able, Turkish authorities were able to confiscate that ring and detain the person who had, I'm not sure if it was bought it or sold it. And so the US government is actually going and trying to recover that ring now because it's part of the seizure of the materials. This, has impact because these are sources that ISIL was using to finance the war. We look at all this damage that's being done, and sometimes I ask myself, and so I just wanted to share with you, can we protect it? Is it a losing battle? Why are we protecting it? And obviously we're losing history with every looting that is done, every building and monument that is destroyed. But we're also losing the information and the provenance of those objects that's attached to them. And we're losing the ability for those countries to then have a resource to turn into tourism in the future too. When stability comes back, if you think about it, if our cities were destroyed, and we were a refugee, would we want to go back? I think that there's a reason to preserve those areas just because that is their home and that we're helping other people with that. And then the one that I hadn't really, it was something I learned at State Department, is the idea that these can be peace building. And the Iraqi Institute, part of the students actually come from Kurdistan and part come from Baghdad. And they're put together, they live in the institute together. So it's a way for them to learn, basically to learn to get along. They're learning English, so they also have this, they're learning English together, and they're building a bridge. And one of the places that's done that outside of Iraq and is a really great model is actually in Cyprus, where you have the Turks and the Greeks in Cyprus. And they've been able to organize projects working on cultural heritage that bring the two groups together. I found a quote from a couple of, one Greek and one Cyprus finishing each other's words that says, "In the end, our work on cultural heritage is not only about stones and buildings. It is really about people and their stories and their capacity to translate it into new encounters and friendships." And all of this, in Syria, there were Christians living near Arabs in peace beforehand. I think rebuilding those bridges is going to be very difficult, and cultural heritage definitely has a role to play in that. And the more that we can preserve of it now, the better a role it can play. So this work is still going on, and it would be, I just wanted to make a plug for these organizations because they both do accept funding, so that there can be donations made for the Institute and also for ASOR CHI. And then I had several acknowledgements. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. And also, I appreciate everyone at AAAS who made my fellowship possible, and at the State Department who worked with me to teach me so much over the year I was there about the heritage. I really hope that someday I can go back to Iraq, someday that it's safe enough. So I was there as a student in 1990, 3 months before the invasion of Kuwait, and it's changed a bit, I think. Thank you.
Questions? Try to use the microphone if we can. Any questions?
So, yeah. I'll give you mine.
I was wondering if all of this destruction and trying to think about repiecing it after it's been destroyed has inspired other countries to start or improve documentation of their artifacts, so that if something like this ever were to happen, it'd be easier to put them back together or preserve them after the fact.
Well, of course, a lot of the destruction, you can't put it back together. You know, the looted objects, the provenance is gone. So, you've lost it. They're a non-renewable resource, I think is one way to look at it. In terms of the efforts, there have actually been a lot of efforts for Iraq and Syria to go back into old excavation reports and get things published, because sometimes archaeology has a very long horizon before everything is fully published. So go back and get things published, artifacts that might be in museums around the world published. But there are lots of efforts to inventory and, again, publish in some way museum collections around the world. That's something that actually has made great advances with the advent of digital photography. Because with a digital camera, you can snap a lot more photos than you can with a film camera. There's been a lot of efforts with 3D scanning going in, because again, you can collect a lot more information that way. But that doesn't help with anything that we don't know. I mean, that's part of the problem. When you look at the sites like Dura Europos, where it has such significant looting, we don't really know what's gone.
In one of the pictures, you said this was one of the earliest scientists, I believe it was for the Freer Institute, and went back to the 60s.
It's Rutherford J. Getton, and he started at the Freer in 1951. He was actually at Harvard in the 30s. So he's the first one at the Freer. There were earlier scientists in museums.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering what they were doing before that. I assumed it was like science was only interested really in the 1960s. So.
Well, I think a lot of things people didn't think to put a scientist in an art museum, right? So, I mean, I'm not talking natural history museums, obviously have scientific staff. But I would say probably the 20s, 30s are when you start to see scientists dealing with art, maybe as a hobby or through the university, but then coming into the museum.
I was wondering how these kinds of efforts intersect with the philosophy of leaving things or bringing things back to their place of origin versus bringing them out of the countries and maybe preserving them in museums but in places that are not their native place.
I guess in some ways, it depends on how it's brought out of its native place, right? If it's brought out, a lot of museum collections, and Sackler included, we don't have excavated materials. So therefore we've lost all that provenance information, and I think that's the case for most museums. I think the Iraqi Institute is actually a very great example of, doing something in the country that can protect objects. And, do we really need to move all those things out of the country? Because that is their patrimony, and, I'm not sure that I believe in moving things out. But of course, we have destruction. Iraq and Syria is not the only place we have this kind of destruction going on. And it happens not just from war. I mean, we have it from building, and we have it from not direct explosions, but a tank going over a site might damage buildings that are under the ground. And there's so much damage. It's not just limited to those countries.
I noticed that some of the faces in this presentation were blurred out. Does the work that you do or any of your colleagues that put you sort of on the target list of any of these terrorist organizations?
Well, the work I was doing was in the US, so not so much, and our names are generally not out there. I mean, if you look at government organizations, it's the higher ups whose names you see. In terms of the people working in country, yes. I mean, one of the examples that came up a couple of years ago was in Palmyra, when ISIS hung the head of the antiquities, because they wanted him to lead them to where the objects that he had beheaded, the objects that he had protected were. So yes, these people were in danger. If you remember the map, Erbil is actually very close to Mosul. So it's very close to areas that were controlled by Islamic State. And some of these people were in Mosul, and I remember hearing things about people being worried about their colleagues.
All right, so I kind of have two questions. They're both kind of related. The first one is, what other than keeping antiquities for themselves, what is the other, what would be the reason for ISIL to just plain destroy stuff? Is it erasing history, or is there another reason?
Well, I think part, because they have the one religion, so when they're targeting Christian churches or what have you, they're getting rid of that part and eradicating it. But I think that a lot of these materials, I think it's clear from that Abu Sayyaf raid where they were getting 20% of the sales price. And I should add that the US is actually one of the largest markets. So that's one of the reasons for our efforts with Homeland Security and where they're looking at these materials. I'm not sure if anything's come in yet. I haven't heard, but we're waiting.
Great, okay. And then the other question is there a significant amount of destruction from US-led or like Saudi-led strikes? Is there a significant amount of that? Or
There was damage when we went into Iraq the first time around after Saddam Hussein. When we went in under Bush, there was damage, and that was one of the reasons that we started working in Iraq with the Iraqi Institute. And so yes, there are cases where the Americans do damage. I would say there are cases, the strikes in Mard al-Numan that I showed are Syrian supported by Russia strikes. So, but it's part of a war. It's a civil war, and Syria is trying to gain back those opposition areas.
So I guess I was wondering, he had mentioned the Monument Men is the classic example of antiquity protection during military action. Has there been any effort to have personnel involved on the ground with military, like there was in World War II, to protect antiquities on site and structures? Not
in these situations. It's been more, how do we empower Syrians in Iraqi to help themselves? The people on the ground after it's safe and after it's left. So there have been people who go in when it gets a little bit safe and survey, but they have professionals who can do that, who are Syrian, who are Iraqi, and so it's been more of a support and training type of role.
So you said that the 20% taxation went to fund the terrorism, and what did the 80% go to that leader that was selling them directly?
No, the 20% went to the leader.
Where did the 80% go?
Went to probably the chain of people who, the looter gets a little cut. And it's like a middleman. The person doing the looting is not going to Turkey to sell the antiquity. So you've got a chain and they all get a little bit.
Other questions?
So are there any more opportunities for on-site research, or is that not a capability because of the dangerous conditions?
There are actually a lot of archaeologists working in Kurdistan right now, so in the north. And I hope that the rest of things will start to open up. But I don't know anyone who's working in Syria or who would even consider going there right now. I think it's also, there's some issues with the US government in Syria, but I should say that we're not the only country working in those areas, and there are people from UNESCO and people from different countries already going back. I believe Italians have been working in Palmyra to help put things back together there.
So are there volunteer programs that you could go through, or would you have to be a part of a certain organization to do that kind of work?
I'm not sure you could get there as a student. So if that's that question, I don't know about volunteer programs. On the other hand, I would think that it's a very limited number of people, and they're probably already trained. So I'm not sure that any volunteers would be going. I know that one of the reasons the Smithsonian took over the effort to lead the Iraqi Institute was that the University of Delaware had used it to send their students, and then it became that they didn't want the students going into an area that was so close to a war zone. Thank you.
I'll follow up on that one. Could you maybe comment on, for the students in the audience, if you want to go into a career in preservation of cultural heritage, art and cultural heritage, what you should do to prepare for that?
So if you want to be a conservator, so there are different career paths. I'm a scientist. If you want to be a conservator, there are a few different programs in the US and also other countries, of course. But for the US programs, they're master's programs, and they tend to require some hands-on art history. So you have to have art history classes. You have to have a chemistry background. And also, so art history classes, but also hands-on art classes, because as a conservator, you would need the hand skills. But then also a chemistry background. One of my early professors was the second class at NYU's in the second class at NYU's conservation school, because she told me that she applied for the first class, and as a physicist, they turned her down, and then they called her up the next year and said, well, we really want people who have a background in science and can understand this, and so she ended up going in the second year. So it's sort of a mixture of art and science. As a scientist, I would say learn as much as you can about science, because I find right now I have projects in looking at Whistler watercolors, Chinese lacquer, so doing GCMS. I work on ceramics with scanning electron microscopy, because if you think of it, we're lucky. I actually have 2 chemists who work with me, but generally a scientist in a museum might be the only one. And so you sort of become a jack of all trades and do a little bit of this. So the stronger science background that you could get, the better. And then any opportunity to work in the field and to build up your experience working with cultural heritage objects. And the more art history and archaeology you learn, the better too.
Okay, I think we can take another question if there is one. One way in the back. You're going to make me work for this one. Maybe you guys can try to get in that back there too. Can you reach over?
I don't know if this is like the most high-level based question, but like, what was the most interesting artifact you found or like researched?
I would say one of the things I'm working on right now is really interesting. We were able to put science into an exhibit, which was really great in our museum. And it's on exhibit right now. They're life-size lacquer Buddhas. So they're made sort of like paper mache. They have a textile underpinning surface, and then they have layers of East Asian lacquer, which is a sap from a tree that's related to poison ivy. And they've put it on sort of as a paste to model it into the Buddha shape. And we found that it's filled with bone. So actually next week I'm going to a USDA meat packing plant to try and get some samples for comparison. So it's been really interesting because we did not expect to find the bone. There were questions of, could it potentially be a holy person who had put in to honor? It turned out we did proteomics, and there's 3 Buddhas like this. There are none in China, and there are 3, one at the Met, one at the Freer, and one at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. And we found that there is equid bone in one of them, and bovine. So something related to horse and something related to cow. And if you can imagine, these things are life-size, so there's actually a lot of bone in them. It's hard, but so that's been pretty cool.
Any other questions?
How can you relate what you learned in the Middle East to preserving antiquities here in the U.S., specifically related to Southeast Utah, where it seems like there's a lot of turmoil regarding that right now?
Okay, I have to admit I don't know too much about Southeast Utah. I should say I'm in a museum that deals mainly with Asian stuff, but I'm assuming that means looting Indian, American Indian, or looting.
So specifically, there's two national monuments that were just reduced in size pretty drastically.
Okay.
And they were both protected under the Antiquities Act, protecting a lot of Native American Anasazi sites. I just want to know what you learned in the Middle East and how we can apply that here as far as preserving antiquities.
Well, I think, it's problematic because we don't have laws to protect antiquities on private lands. And of course, if it's a national park, we do have laws to protect the antiquities. But I think there's always a balance between progress and our heritage. And I should also say I work for the federal government. So I think that it's a difficult problem all around. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I think on that very hard question, we'll stop there and thank Dr. McCarthy again. And if you have any questions, you can take a few minutes with her afterwards. So. And we'll see you all at the next lecture on April 12th.